Hello, welcome. All right, so get your names down, and we are going to cover the Latino experience in the Great Depression. All right. So thank you for being here, like always. And let's see here. All right. So moving on to hope you guys are doing okay. Anybody have any questions or comments? All right, feel free to ask me to unmute yourself at any time if you have any questions about the class, the grading, the assignments being put up, and all that. Okay. So I pretty much give myself away in the first paragraph here. Three factors seem to habitually dictate Anglo-Latino relations during the early 1900s: economic realities, political occurrences, and the pendulum swing of popular and political sentiment, how they're feeling, right? When an economic demand exists for Latino labor, and there's no friction between the US and Mexico, and popular sentiment is not swinging toward being xenophobic, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants were tolerated, albeit while exploited. Conversely, when the American capitalist system experienced downturns, when the US and Mexico were at odds, and when popular sentiment leaned toward some regressive fictional return to Anglo-Saxon Americana, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants suffered from an acceleration of discrimination. I'm so sorry. Of all times, all day, I'm getting the hiccups. Let's see here. So this is a little bit redundant, going through the Porfiriato from the progressive one. So I'm going to go a little past the Mexican Revolution, number 1 million immigrants during Mexico's revolution. All right. And note here, during the progressive era and roaring 20s, a regressive, even a xenophobic element existed in America's mainstream culture. What it was known as was the culture war, right? When you do your US history, that's usually the discourse that your instructor will tailor all the information around. Between those who were embracing the changes that were coming about in the nation versus those who were frightened by those changes. All right. So this cultural war was fought on many grounds. For one, right, people were still had that progressive anti-big business sentiment. A lot of people were concerned that we were finally in the 1920s an urban country, whereby cities of at least 2,500 people constituted the place where the majority of Americans now lived, rather than in rural areas on farms, etc. And then in the cities, lots of things came with that. Lots of businesses, lots of entertainment, jazz music came of age. The Harlem Renaissance blew up. You have the new attire by Coco de Chanel, and the women that were wearing it. It was a symbol of independence for the young and middle-aged women. Oftentimes, they were called the flapper, right? And so women, the divorce rate went up considerably. They had a Muncie, Indiana project whereby conservative sociologists met at Muncie, Indiana, and they thought, okay, if the changes that the nation is experiencing have hit this small town, then we're in trouble. And their findings frightened the conservatives. A lot of evidence of premarital sex, consumerism, kids not being supervised during now a new period known as adolescence. That's relatively new to human history. Most of the time, you go in the colonial days, you hit puberty, and you go from being treated as a child to being treated as an adult. I mean, there was nothing in between. But now the number of people going to college went up by 3 times, went up 300%, and including girls. And now that is some time where they can kind of sow their wild oats, right? So the findings of the Muncie, Indiana project were very alarming. You also had the Hayes Committee with the Catholic Church and some people in the State Department united in looking at immorality on the public screen, because Hollywood, that was the heyday of Hollywood suddenly in the 20s. And not only did you find a change in themes, morals, the characters played on the screen. I remember reading something about like the leading lady. At first, it was like Mary Pickford. And Pickford was very like a damsel in distress, the old school woman, always in need of a man to help save her, etc. And then it went to Claire Bow and Louise Brooks. And they were kind of a femme fatale. They slept with a lot of men, and they were lighthearted about it. They broke hearts. They didn't settle down with any one person. And this was all concerning to the conservatives, right? They're saying that, the country's going to hell in the handbasket, right? During the 1920s, during these roaring 20s. Average per capita disposable income went up by at least 17%. And also people for the first time in the 20s were buying on credit. And people were abusing that right from the get-go. So that's going on. And then you had cases in the stock market whereby everyone seemed to be buying their stocks on credit and on margin, as it was called. And in doing that, they were betting on their stock going up. So oftentimes they didn't really even have the money. And they waited for the stock value to rise above that which they ostensibly bought it. And then they just took the loan out from their profits once the stock went up. And that happened, and they succeeded in doing that for a while, right? And then the farmers got greedy as well. What the farmers began doing is they began moving into the Midwest, into like Oklahoma, Kansas, the panhandle of Texas, and selling wheat and other cash crops for a lot of money, because Europe was still war-torn from World War I in the early 20s. And they had kind of a sure bet with European consumers for their farm products and an American consumption market, because Americans were doing so well overall in the 1920s per capita. And so, but what they began doing is they began refusing to allow 1/3 of their land at any given time to lay fallow. Supposedly, you're supposed to, take it easy on 1/3 of your land at any given time, and allow the nutrients to become replenished. So you don't, like, I don't know, I think of it as like washing your hair twice a day, every day, and how that can actually do damage to your hair. They were exhausting the soil. So at any rate, because they were getting greedy, because they saw the profits that were to be made in cash crop farming. Well, before you know it, the Ukraine jumps back and starts selling a lot of wheat to the Europeans. The Europeans put up tariff walls, import tariffs on our wheat and food products, so that artificially made the price of their food products higher in Europe and people less inclined to buy them. And so it all kind of hit at once toward the end of the 1920s. And then in addition to that, of course, right at the season of tilling, of disking the land for corn and wheat, when you get the topsoil up at the very top with all the nitrogen in it, there came a big dust storm. And the dust storm was incredible. I mean, literally tons of soil was blown all the way to Detroit and Chicago from Oklahoma. And so with this dust storm, it hit people hard. And then in addition to that, the farmers they kept trying to improve on their machinery, and they had to borrow money for the machinery. And what they were counting on is always making a good profit to be able to pay that back. And in taking those loans for the machinery, they put their farms up for collateral. And so when the dust storm hit and people no longer were buying our wheat and corn, suddenly they appealed to Congress to buy their corn and wheat and to kind of bail them out. And we had Republican administrations all throughout the 20s. Harding died in 23 before the end of his term of natural causes, and Silent Coolidge, and then Hoover, all Republicans. And they were all small government Republicans by now. And so, well, they were sort of small government. They helped big business. They were for tariff walls to protect our manufacturers. They were for subsidizing key industries, and they were also for tax breaks. In claiming to be libertarian, they did not exercise the amendment for the income tax very well. And a lot of people got around paying their taxes, especially the big guys who had smart lawyers. So at any rate, they said no to the farmers and said, that's a handout. You need to be self-reliant, etc. So it happened 2 or 3 seasons in a row. And then by that time, they had to default on their loans. And the banks came in and foreclosed their farms as their collateral, their promise to pay back the loans. So it varied the stats from region to region, but there were some areas in Oklahoma, especially, whereby at least 3 out of 5 farms were shut down and foreclosed by the banks, and they had to get off their land. So then you had the Dust Bowl, right, with the famous Okies coming from the Midwest, and they were desperate for jobs here in the agricultural sector in California, especially the Imperial Valley, just north of Los Angeles. So they come in, and then with the Mexican Americans, you see that they already had plenty of problems, right? Mexican immigrants, when they came in, they were allowed when the time was fine. When everything was fine economically, they were welcomed to come and work as day laborers. And this is the beginning of Mexican people following the harvests across the border, coming up for certain fruits and vegetables, harvest time, and then come back down and go back down into Sonora, Coahuila, and Chihuahua, and just kind of birds of passage going back and forth. And so at any rate, as you notice here, they were paid more here on American farms than they were on Mexican haciendas. So you see their economic incentive to come up and work here. And then he says, Ray Suarez, this is a great book. I was just having you guys look at the Spanish to keep me accountable for my translations. But this Spanish book is just great. But he says here, right, that that the Mexican American communities became as American as apple pie during the era of the Roaring 20s. He claims interweaving Mexican culture with popular music, the movies, and U.S. fashion. And so Mexican Americans became a, quote, hybrid people, both Mexican and American. They began to marry whom they chose. They bought automobiles, radios, the new era attire, as clothing. They went to the movies. They shopped at department stores. They enjoyed dance halls, pool halls, and bars, etc. Okay. And then they had the Mexican consulate at places like Los Angeles that kept them in touch with their Mexican traditions. All right. So this cultural mixing, Suarez claims, was mutual, as the transformative power of the United States changed the people that came here. Meanwhile, the new immigrants at the same time changed the places to which they arrived. So there was good syncretism. Americans were embracing Mexican culture, and the Mexicans were embracing American culture. All right. In places like LA and San Antonio, gringos flocked to Mexican restaurants. They wanted Spanish architecture. They intermarried with Latinos. Okay. And however, it says that some who came from the East Coast and some of the Okies who came from the Midwest, that they despised the Mexican people. So you still had that old malice that did not completely go away. And then you had still that kind of Sambo image of Mexican-American men. Right. So they came and they tried to vie for Latinos' jobs. At this moment, xenophobia was no longer mitigated by economic motives, but assisted by them. Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans lumped together became a convenient scapegoat of job thieves amidst a popular consensus that, quote, Americans should be taken care of firstly. Right. Suddenly, employment amongst Latinos skyrocketed to rates higher than those amongst Anglos. Then the New Deal happened. Franklin Roosevelt comes in and he generically says he's going to have a New Deal. And it was under reform, recovery, and there are 2 R's or 3. Recovery, reform. Oh, shame on me. I forget the 3rd one. Dang it. But at any rate, they come in, right? And at first they tried to bail out the banks. They made them apply to the Federal Reserve System, and in applying to the Federal Reserve, they had to keep so much of their money present, a certain portion of the deposits present at any given time. The federal government could look over as to whom they were lending money to make sure that all different income brackets were represented. That's what they had to do in return for being bailed out. Then also in return for being bailed out, the banks had to give a second chance to people for their mortgages who had gone under losing their homes and their farms under the Lemke Act. So they were given a second chance to try to get their farms and their homes back. And it worked for some people, but not all, obviously. So he tried to save the banking system kind of first. He put the SEC in charge of the stock market to let people know that there were going to be strict laws over the stock market from now on. And that helped a little bit to get people to be willing to dabble in the stock market again after they lost all hope in it when it crashed in 29 in October. And so then he gave direct work relief. And we've not known this before nor since. Like the WPA at any given time had 2.5 million Americans directly employed by the federal government to do public works of all different sorts. And note before that, the federal government, state governments, if they have bridges to be built, roads, etc., buildings, they go through a private company. Private company hires who they desire, pay them what they want to pay them, etc. Now this is the federal government directly giving a job to millions of people through the CCC, the WPA, etc. So that was kind of unheard of. And this is part of the discourse at that time that that Franklin Roosevelt was a radical. Because when you look, right, the Soviet Union did directly employed its people. So did Nazi Germany at the same time, where the government is having people do public works and directly paying them. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to give purchasing power to the average American family. Because to him, it's called Keynesian economics or Keynesian economics, after John Maynard Keynes, is that they believe the health of an economy rests on the spending power of the average person. That as long as the average person has money to spend and is willing and able to go to the market and spend that money, then that's the first great indicator of a growing, healthy economy. So that's what they're trying to do. And in fairness to Franklin Roosevelt, he did not go out of his way to try to have these federal work programs discriminatory on race. However, because he was worried about his critics, the critics contended that he should, because there were uniforms that Americans wore with the direct relief programs, of work relief programs, and his critics were saying they might as well wear black, like in Nazi Germany, and it's like people working for Hitler. So I think part of worried about a backlash of him being too radical for doing this, he allowed the states and local governments to carry his programs out. And that became a problem because the local and state areas had their own prejudices against certain demographics. So they hired other people first before them. So African Americans suffered this in the South. Mexican Americans suffered this in the West. All right. So at any rate, let's see. So during the Depression, agricultural wages in the Imperial Valley of Southern California fell from 35 cents an hour in 28 to only 14 cents an hour in 33. Everything went down during the Depression. And remember, at any given time, there were a quarter of American people of the workforce out of work. That's just insane. 1 out of every 4. All right. So Latino field workers then began to seek industrial and service sector jobs. This put further strain on economic competition for those scarce jobs. Hence, it brought out America's xenophobic traditional roots, right? Authorities in Santa Barbara, California, forcefully sent a crowd of Mexican job seekers into the Southern Pacific train depot for a southern trip back across the border. Unemployment rates were higher for Latinos, 1 out of 7, than for other demographics that did not shield them from being perceived as a threat. Then the local government passed the Alien Labor Act, which prohibited companies doing business with the government from employing, quote, aliens or immigrants. So when the going gets tough and times are harsh, America turns xenophobic, and it turns inward, and the Mexican Americans suffer for it. All right. You see here, the local officials began giving preference and welfare allocations as well to the American born. So at this time, some left back for Mexico. All right. In coordination, local businesses, federal, local authorities carried out a series of raids that began with a forced deportation of over 300 Mexican immigrants in 1931. Okay. So approximately 500,000 Latinos returned to Mexico during the harsh 1930s. Right. The ugly side of America. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions? Kind of a depressing story. All right, you guys. So if you don't mind, I'm going to let you go. I don't feel well at all, but I didn't want to leave you guys hanging. So I made myself do this today, but to be honest, I'm physically feeling awful. So I'm going to let you go. Okay. Thank you. I have your names.
Hope you feel better.
Thank you. Thank
Hope
you.
you feel better, Professor. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too. Thanks, Derek.